and bienvenue. Thank you so much for joining us. I am Jay Gitlin, the Chair of Canadian Studies at Yale. I would like to thank Hira Jaffrey and the Macmillan Center for sponsoring Canadian events at Yale. We have, I am pleased to tell you, a robust Canadian Studies program, and will continue to have events this year and in the future. This spring, the very first issue of the Yale Journal of Canadian Studies will appear in print, edited by Professor Wendell Adjete, Yale PhD, and now Assistant Professor of History at McGill. And I want you to know, if you have any questions or suggestions about Canadian Studies at Yale, please email me at jay.gitlin, Gitlin, @yale.edu. So it is now my great pleasure to introduce Brendan Shanahan, who organized and will be our moderator of this panel. Brendan Shanahan is a postdoctoral associate here at Macmillan Center for the Study of Representative Institutions and a lecturer in the Yale Department of History. After completing his undergraduate studies at McGill, Brendan headed west to UC Berkeley for grad school, where he studied North American immigration and citizenship history and was a member of CAL's interdisciplinary Canadian Studies program. At Yale, he has revised his dissertation on nativist politics and alienage law in post-Civil War American history into a book manuscript, and recently published a spin-off article on that topic in Law and History Review. As a postdoc, Brendan has also had the great pleasure of developing several undergraduate seminars, which I have heard great things about from students, seminars in North American immigration and political history. And as luck would have it, this semester he is teaching History 154J, Neighboring Democracies, Representative Politics in the United States and Canada, 1607 to the present. So he is the ideal person to be our moderator. Brendan, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Jay, and for the opportunity to help lead this panel and present among such a wonderful group of scholars. And before we do, I'd just like to start with a few introductions, housekeeping items, and thank yous. Monday was election day in Canada. Two-term serving Prime Minister Justin Trudeau rolled the electoral dice to try to turn his Liberal Party plurality of seats in the House of Commons back into a majority, which he had lost 2 years ago. After a bit more than a month of fierce campaigning among 5 parties nationally, 6 in Quebec, and fluctuating opinion polls, the results are mostly in. And the new parliament looks remarkably similar to its predecessor in terms of relative partisan control. The Liberals were returned with a strong plurality, but still about a dozen seats short of an overall majority, which would require 170. The Conservatives came in second and will be the official opposition at a bit less than 120. The Bloc Québécois took a bit more than 30, and the NDP looks to take about a couple dozen, with the Green Party at a bit less than a handful. Incumbent defeats, absent a major personal scandal, were far and few between. Liberal MP Brenda Shanahan narrowly lost her seat to British Columbian-born turned Quebec nationalist Patrick O'Hara in a riding on Montreal's South Shore. Similar name to yours truly aside, that sounds like an interesting story. But there weren't too many just like that. The electoral reproduction of a parliament so similar to that of its predecessor has led commentators in Canada and abroad to declare this election to be a wash. Simply a return to the status quo anti-election. A Seinfeld election I've seen thrown about, or even, as the New York Times has called it, an election to nowhere. These different turns of phrase aside, there is certainly something to the fact that when the MPs convene in Parliament next time, there won't need to be that much shuffling around of seats among the government and opposition benches. But can there ever be such a thing as a status quo election? Does a campaign in and of itself produce new political calculations, transform the terms of debate in unexpected ways, and shape policy and politics for years ahead to come? To discuss these and other issues, we've assembled this great panel. First up will be Professor David Cameron, sharing the name of a certain British Prime Minister who has a bit of experience with unusual elections. Our David Cameron is a renowned professor here at Yale, where he teaches and researches on a wide array of subjects in political science. He has published extensively on European politics, the European Union, international trade and governance, and Canadian constitutionalism. He recently co-edited with Richard Albert, Canada and the World, Comparative Perspectives on the Canadian Constitution, published by Cambridge University Press. Following Professor Cameron, we're privileged to have Dr. Shannon Sampert share her thoughts on the campaign. Shannon is a communications expert, political analyst, journalist, and after earning her PhD in political science from the University of Alberta, a former professor at the University of Winnipeg. A scholar of gender and Canadian politics and communications, among many, many other subjects. She has previously served as the op-ed editor of the Winnipeg Free Press. She currently runs Media Diva Consulting, which provides writing and PR services, and is no stranger to the spotlight, serving as a frequent commentator and interlocutor on Canadian politics in newspapers, public affairs publications, and more. Next up, we're thrilled to have Professor W. Andy Knight, political science professor at the University of Alberta, and the 2021-2022 Fulbright Distinguished Chair in International and Area Studies here at Yale. Andy is one of Canada's foremost international relations scholars, having taught extensively about, published widely on, and intervened directly in fields ranging from global security, international development, diplomacy, and much more. His CV, I'm not joking, is about as lengthy as a small book and includes roughly 20 monographs authored, co-authored, or co-edited on these themes. For these accomplishments, Professor Knight has been recognized as a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. And finally, Brendan Shanahan, will offer some comments on the political historical context behind this minority parliament and make a few arguments about what I see as its historical analogies and lessons we can take from them. A couple brief housekeeping items before I turn the panel over to David. We're trying to keep this roundtable-esque, so we'll each present pretty short remarks, have a bit of crosstalk among us, and then open to questions. If you'd like to add your question to the queue at any time, please feel free to do so in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. I'm so grateful to have this opportunity. Thanks again to Hira Jaffrey, to Jay Gitlin, to the Canadian Studies Committee, and to my home center, the Center for the Study of Representative Institutions, for bringing me here to have this opportunity. And to our whole panel and to you for making the time to be here, thanks so much. We can't wait to have a wonderful discussion. Without any further ado, I turn the floor over to David.
Okay, thanks very much, Brendan. I'm going to, I think my assigned task is to say something about the results. So I will try to do that in a somewhat parsimonious way. But I'll start just by mentioning two developments that I think were working in favor of the Liberals at the time Justin Trudeau called the election on August 15th. One was the record, Canada's record in terms of vaccinations, which is very good. And Canada's rate of vaccination is greater than that of the UK, the EU, and by a good distance, the US. The second factor that's relevant is that the economy is doing very well this year. It's rebounding from the contraction last year, a serious contraction in GDP, but the growth rate is now expected to be just over 6% this year. If anyone reading everything we know about political science, if you happen to have a growth rate of 6%, you should call an election. right? Well, it didn't work out quite the way Trudeau planned, and for at least two reasons. I think one, many people saw the move to snap election as self-indulgent, attempting to win the gratitude of the population for all the good work the government had done. And I think it was clear at the time he called the election that the Liberals probably wouldn't win a majority. And in fact, it's interesting that the polls that were out as of August 15th indicated a vote, a slight decline in the vote to 31, 32%. And perhaps if they were lucky, they might get 158, 59, 60 seats, but they would fall short of the majority that they need in the House, where there were 338 seats. Majority is 170. But there's also one other thing worth noting is that I think the view of the snap election as not being desirable from the point of view of many people was reflected in the turnout rate that we've seen. Now the votes are still being counted and will be counted for some time because of the mail-in balloting and so forth. But as of this afternoon, the turnout rate is about 61%, which is the second lowest in Canadian history. The only one that's in the 50s, high 50s, is the one in 2008. Now it may go up a little bit, but nevertheless, there've been, it's clear there have been a lot of people who just decided not to participate for various reasons. Some of them very legitimate, I'm sure, given the COVID pandemic that's going on. As you know, just to summarize very quickly the results, and you can find these, those of you who would like to track these in more detail, you can go to Elections Canada, where you'll find the results. But as of today, the Liberals have 151 elected MPs, and they have 7 candidates who are leading in their ridings. So if they win all 7 of those, they will get 158, which is an astounding gain of 1 over what they had going out of the House. The vote is a little bit down in terms of share of the vote, about 32% compared with 33% in 2019. They lost 2 of their 10 seats in Nova Scotia, but they gained 2, interestingly, in Alberta. The 7 that are still out as of sometime a few hours ago are 4 in Ontario, 2 in BC, and 1 in Ontario, 1 in Quebec. And if they take all 7 of those, they would still end up losing 2 of their 35 seats in Quebec, 1 of their 79 seats in Ontario, but they would gain 4 seats in BC. The Conservatives have elected 119 members. There are no districts out at this point, though some may change because of the narrow votes. But at least as of this moment, 119 have been elected, and that is a drop of 2. The vote share dropped a little bit to 33.8%, but even if they didn't win in the election, they at least have the pleasure of knowing that they did better than the Liberals in terms of the share of the vote. The Conservatives gained a seat in Newfoundland, 2 in Nova Scotia, 1 in New Brunswick, which is interesting, a move to the Atlantic. Not surprising in some sense, but they did lose 7 seats in the West, 3 in Alberta and 4 in BC. And that's an interesting shift in gains and losses. And I think it has to do with several factors. First of all, the leadership of the party is now in the hands of Erin O'Toole, at least for some indeterminate time in the near future, who is from Durham, Ontario. And he, of course, is not Stephen Harper from Alberta or Scheer from Saskatchewan, who were the previous leaders. O'Toole's moderation clearly worked against him among some in the Conservative Party. He backtracked a bit on social issues, on gun issue, and that I think opened people up to look at an alternative on the right of the spectrum, and Shannon will be saying more about that. So I think those 2 factors work to some extent, but it is interesting that the Conservatives did better in picking up some seats in Atlantic Canada, but lost out west. I should just mention briefly, and I won't go on for much longer, but in terms of the Bloc Québécois, they picked up, they left in, they won 32 seats in 2019, and it looked like they would win possibly 34, with 2 that were in which their candidate was leading. As of yesterday, they won one of those 2, and so they have 33 seats, and they may get 34. And they were clearly helped, I think, at least. It's hard to say exactly how and where and by how much, but by the comments that the moderator of the first televised debate made about Quebec being racist and having discriminatory laws, which I think offended a number of people obviously in Quebec, and might have fueled some support for the Bloc in that province. The NDP won 24 seats in 2019, and it will probably end up with 25. It picked up some support and almost 2 percentage points in the vote. It lost a seat in Newfoundland, and it lost one of its 6 seats in Ontario, but it picked up a 2nd seat in Alberta, and it won 12, and it's leading in the 13th seat in BC. So the NDP comes out of it relatively well. The fact that it did well out west, of course, is partly a reflection of its leader. Singh is from Barnaby in BC. So they're there, they're important. One of the most surprising outcomes was the poor performance of the Greens in the election. In 2019, 2 years ago, they got 6.6%. And this year they only got 2.3%. The leader herself lost Toronto Centre, and probably that party will go through a leadership change. They lost a seat in New Brunswick. They lost one of the 2 they had in BC. So the net effect is they won 2 seats, which is a loss of 1. And last but not least, and as Shannon will probably pick up on this, the People's Party, led by Bernier, won about 5% of the vote. They won no seats, but they were certainly an important voice in a number of the areas where there were disenchanted conservatives who thought that O'Toole was really not Stephen Harper, which is true. So the People's Party, although they got no representation, they have to come out of this thinking that they're in position for the next election, at least to continue. I think I'll stop at that point and turn it back to you, Brendan.
Thank you so much, David, and pass the baton right to Shannon.
Thank you so much, and thanks so much for having me here. I'm going to do a share screen here and do my presentation. I have a PowerPoint for you. And I'm going to talk about how I do not see this election as more of the same for a number of reasons, because I like to actually look at the numbers in a lot of ways at sort of delving behind the scenes and talk about really the rise of the PPC in Canada. In a lot of numbers, logistically, the PPC went from absolutely nothing to overall in Canada getting 5% of the vote in 2019. They went to 5th place in terms of the overall vote, ahead of the Greens in this election, which is quite surprising and actually a stunning victory. If we had something other than a first past the post type of system, this means that the the PPC party would actually have members of parliament in the Canadian House of Commons, to put succinctly. The Conservative War Room suggests that in some ridings, the PPC actually supplanted the Green vote. In other words, up to 25% of the PPC vote was actually disenchanted Green Party voters. And I think that might be actually the case in some of the Ontario ridings, because it's largely a protest vote. These are individuals who are fed up with the conventional parties and have to have some place to park their vote. Or it may indeed just be people who don't want to vote at all, but have now a voice and a place to park their vote, and it's the PPC. But in Alberta and places like Saskatchewan and Manitoba, it's a place for disenchanted Conservatives to find a place. And in Alberta, it largely resulted in 4 ridings going to either NDP or Liberal. And that also fed into this dissatisfaction with the Alberta Premier, Jason Kenney. So when you see an Alberta riding, like in Edmonton Centre, going to 60% NDP, something is going on. That's largely, they don't like the Premier and they don't like what's going on with the Conservative vote. And that's what's happened. So the PPC strength in pockets of resistance in the West are stunning. In Alberta, overall, it's 7.4% of the vote. But when you look at the actual ridings, it's as high as 12.9% or 12% overall. In Manitoba, it's as high as 20% in some of the ridings, 21% in Portage-Lisker and 16.4%. These ridings went to Conservative candidates, but that's a huge chunk of people who are disenchanted with the Conservatives and with the Liberals to park their vote with the PPC. In Saskatchewan, the overall vote was 6.7%. This places them 4th, but there's 9.6% in these ridings that park their vote behind the PPC. Almost 10%. It's significant, and it tells us that something is going on. It's more than just same old election. It's a different riding. It's a different numbers. It's a different perspective. And it's a strength and bubbles of resistance that we're seeing in the West. What's going on? Well, meet Mad Max. For those of you who don't know who this is Max Bernier. Frankly, a lackluster, disgraced cabinet minister from Stephen Harper's campaign. This guy didn't do a great deal. He used to be the foreign affairs minister. He was mostly well known for leaving security documents in his girlfriend's bathroom. And his girlfriend, by the way, had ties to the bikers. So he had to actually resign his cabinet seat and then ran for the leadership of the Conservative Party, placed second, and then had a big pout because of that, and left the party and became the leader of the People's Party. He was considered too extreme for many of the conservatives because of his libertarian perspective, his anti-immigration perspective, and he became the leader of the People's Party. But ladies and gentlemen, this man is not exactly what we would consider the sharpest knife in the drawer. And yet he's gone on to become an extremely powerful and strong presence as the leader of the People's Party. And the Mad Max Freedom Tour certainly has stoked a lot of interest and a lot of people going to the tour that he's been on. So what's the big sell? Well, he likes guns. And he likes the fact that the economy is open at any costs. He's an anti-vaxxer. He's a libertarian. He doesn't like refugees. He doesn't like immigrants. He's anti-intellectual and he's anti-science. And he's also anti-climate change. Is this starting to ring a bell to anybody? Does it sound familiar to anyone in any kind of Trumpian perspective? Because it starts to ring the bell for people who have lived through what we went through in the United States the last 4 years. I had the opportunity to travel to the United States just before Mr. Trump was elected in whatever year that was, 2014. And I went with a number of Canadians at the behest of the State Department. We went through, landed in Washington, DC, went to New Orleans, and then ended up in Cleveland the night before the Trump election. We got to see what happens in the Rust Belt. We got to see how angry people were about the fact that their lives weren't seen as important by the elite, that immigrants were coming in and taking away their jobs, that climate change was forcing them out of their ways that they made livings, and that they were being told over and over again that the way that they talked, the way that they thought, the way that they saw their lives was wrong. And Mr. Trump came along and said, I am not going to do business as usual. I'm going to give you a new way of thinking. In very many ways, Mad Max is selling the same kind of canard. Let's look at his platform. On gun control, firearms have always been part of the Canadian tradition and culture. It's very similar to the idea that we have the right to bear arms in the United States. On public health measures to prevent the spread of COVID, this experiment was largely ineffective in reducing the spread of the virus, but caused significant collateral damage. In fact, on his webpage, he suggested that the idea of putting people, creating these public health measures is not the standard in preventing the spread of COVID. And that the people who are dying of COVID already had other reasons for dying, that it wasn't COVID that was actually behind the deaths that are occurring. On immigration, over the past 3 years, the Liberal government has done nothing to stop the flow of tens of thousands of asylum seekers illegally crossing our borders. Accepting all these refugees will cost taxpayers billions of dollars. On free speech, our university campuses, a growing number of faculty and administrators, those who should be fighting for open debate of controversial ideas, have become aggressive advocates for censorship. On climate change, there is, however, no scientific consensus on the theory that CO2 produced by human activity is causing dangerous global warming today. Nobody believes this, do they? Well, except I was on an Ottawa talk show program the other day, and we had a phone call from a woman in Alberta saying that Trudeau, all he wants to do is turn us into a bunch of communists. I've never heard the word racism until Trudeau was elected. Trudeau is all about making us racist. I'm not allowed to speak my mind anymore. Where is this coming from? A PPC platform? Where is it coming from? You have to ask the question. So why should we be worried? Well, there's growing concerns of violence. A Canadian Prime Minister has never before had to be concerned about violence on the election front. But this time, Prime Minister Trudeau had to cancel at least 2 outings because of being pelted by rocks. We don't talk about it here in Canada, but we've already had our first potential case where our Prime Minister has been potentially a victim of violence. An individual was arrested after he was found with a truck full of dynamite and explosives, and sent away and arrested and detained. We don't call that a potentially an assassination attempt because we're Canadians. We don't like to talk about it, but it was an assassination attempt against the Canadian Prime Minister. He, by the way, is a right-wing extremist. He's from Manitoba. Go Manitoba. And he has been identified as being a member of the right-wing extremists that we're now identifying as hometown terrorism. There are growing concerns of violence. The anti-racist, the Canadian Anti-Hate Network and founder of Anti-Racist Canada, Kurt Phillips, says the rage that exists in the movement, I don't know where it's going to go after this election. The Institute for the Strategic Dialogue found that COVID-19 has had such a significant impact on the growth of right-wing extremism in Canada. Trudeau and the NDP have received the bulk of that anger. And the face of that anger is the PPC and Maxime Bernier. We also have growing regionalism going on in the West with Wexit on the horizon. The Abacus poll in 2020 suggests that the Wexit party, led by another Harper ex-MP, is roughly supported in some ways by up to 40% of Westerners. We could say over and over again that this election was a $600 million cabinet shuffle, and it meant nothing, except there is some anger that is going on there, where 20% of people said, I'm angry enough to elect Mad Max as the potential leader of my anger vote. I'm angry enough to pelt the sitting prime minister with gravel. I'm angry enough to sit outside of hospitals and call people who are going into hospitals sheep. I'm angry enough today to tell people who are journalists who are asking questions about the PPC leadership to get raped and die. That's what is happening now to journalists who are questioning the PPC leader. Where does this anger go? That's my question. And so the PPC and the rise of anti-liberalism, anti-NDP, and regionalism in the Western provinces, it's something we have to look for. It's not going anywhere. And that's, I'm more than happy to have conversations about this as we go on. Thanks for your time.
Thank you so much, Shannon. And I'm going to turn the floor back over to Andy to present momentarily.
Thank you, Brendan. I know that I can still see Shannon's stuff on the screen, so I wonder. I'm not going to show PowerPoint, but I want to. I just want to be able to talk to you about what I think is happening here in the Canadian election. This is the 44th federal election of Canada, and we have seen many people argue that the Prime Minister called this election because of hubris, not because the people of Canada wanted this election. But I would argue that elections are all about trying to get the sort of the temperature of the country and the pulse of the country. And in some ways, although $600 million were spent on this election, and the results were, as David pointed out very well, very similar to what happened in 2019, I think that sends a pretty good signal to Canada, to the Prime Minister of Canada, that people want him to go back to work, as he mentioned in his own speech to the public at the end of the night on Monday. People want him to go back to work and to work with the other parties in order to get things done for Canada. So I think Canadians want the Prime Minister to be a little bit more consultative, to be a little bit more collaborative, to work with the NDP, to push the progressive agenda for Canada. And there's a progressive agenda, I think, that you can actually see in the platforms of the Liberal Party, as well as in the platforms of the NDP and the Greens. So to me, it was not a waste of time to have this election. I just wanted to raise a point about the fact that some of the people in Canada who are so anti-Trudeau and anti-the Liberals are missing the point that a lot of people outside of Canada actually support what Prime Minister Trudeau has done. And I just want to quote you a few things from people who endorsed Prime Minister Trudeau just before the election was called. Starting with, going back to 2016, before Joe Biden relinquished his role as Vice President of the United States. He's once said that Justin Trudeau, on his final foreign trip to Canada, the world is looking to spend a lot of time looking at you, Mr. Prime Minister, as we see more and more challenges to the liberal international order than at any time since the end of World War II. Canada can be viewed as one of those middle powers that will be looked to preserve a world based around rules and rights, rather than power and might. I know Canada's had a very good experience in terms of pushing for a rules-based international system. And I think the Liberal Party and Prime Minister Trudeau represents that kind of rules-based system. And Canada has had this experience, working as a middle power on issues such as peacekeeping, the Landmines Treaty, women's rights, the responsibility to protect norm, the creation of the International Criminal Court, etc. Now that Joe Biden is U.S. Prime President, now I think he is happy to see Canada as a partner in pushing back Trump administration's threat to the liberal world order. So there's something to be said about that. Barack Obama, during the campaign, actually on Twitter, called Trudeau an effective leader and a strong voice for democratic values. And Obama endorsed Trudeau in 2019 federal election, and he also endorsed him in this election. I know that some Canadians were quite angry with this and felt that he was interfering in Canadian politics, but the reality is that's not what interference in politics is all about. This is the endorsement from a private citizen now in the United States. Hillary Clinton, also a private citizen now in the United States, endorsed Trudeau, citing his leadership in the fight for accessible childcare, which of course has allowed women to remain in the workforce, protection of reproductive rights, ambitious climate change action. And Joe Biden, at the end of the night, congratulated him. He was a little bit more reserved about giving his support during the campaign and waited until after the election victory to speak to Trudeau about the need to work together to rebuild the economies of both countries, particularly in the post-endemic pandemic period, and to continue to fight against the COVID-19 pandemic, to continue to deepen collaboration between Canada and the United States. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson saluted Trudeau's win for his third straight victory. And the UK, said the UK and Canada are great friends and perhaps the best partners that you can have. And he looked forward to working closely with the Prime Minister in the years ahead. Now, I say this because it's important to understand how the world views the Prime Minister of Canada now, Prime Minister Trudeau, because there's a lot of resentment about Trudeau and Trudeau's privilege, and the fact that he is the son of former Prime Minister Trudeau. There's a lot of resentment from some corners in Canada. But I think we have to respect the fact that there are people outside of Canada that view him as being perhaps a reliable partner in beating back the challenge to the liberal order that we've had since 1945. And there is a role for middle powers like Canada to play in doing so. The 2015 Paris Agreement is in trouble on climate change. The World Trade Organization is in trouble. The World Health Organization is challenged. Human rights regimes are challenged. There's an immigration crisis, there's a migration crisis happening. When you look at Myanmar, the need for responsibility to protect is there. So there are a whole bunch of areas that cry out for some sort of alliance of multilateralism, which the French and the Germans have been pushing, and which Canada, as a middle power, can actually help to support. So I believe that the outcome of this election, having another Liberal government, may be actually quite good for Canada, and may in fact be important in engaging the world in a more plurilateral format to deal with the challenges that the world faces. And Canada could become a leader among countries in this particular setting. So I just going to leave it at that for the time being. I just wanted to sort of show that there is a foreign policy side to this that we sometimes leave out during election campaigns. In fact, I lamented the other day to my class that throughout the campaign there was hardly any talk about foreign policy. And the problem is that we are living now in an interdomestic era in which the lines between the international and the domestic are so blurred that we can't really separate out what goes on outside the country from what goes on within the country. We need to therefore deal with those issues that are going to affect us domestically, even although it might seem to be far away. So let me leave it there, and I'm sure we'll have a robust conversation about this.
Thank you so much, Andy. I'm going to pick up the baton for one last presentation before crosstalk and Q&A. About this time 2 years ago, I had the pleasure of sharing my thoughts on the historical context behind and lessons we might learn from the 2019 Canadian federal election in my first talk, actually, as a postdoc at Yale. At that time, following Justin Trudeau's first successful re-election, which saw his majority reduced to a minority, I asked if the results suggested a return to a renewed period of minority parliaments. And if so, whether the outcome in 2019 represented a continuation of a long era of predominantly minority governments stretching back to 2004, or if 2019 was distinct from the early to late aughts, perhaps rhyming more with an earlier era in Canadian political history, such as that from the mid-1950s all the way to the late 1970s, during which minority governments were especially common. 2 years ago, I was hesitant to propose any definitive answer on either question, as historians are wont to do so. But the verdict seems pretty clear to me now on the first question, With the election of another minority parliament this Monday, again led by the Liberals, 5 of the last 7 Canadian federal elections have denied the winning party majority control in the Commons. As CBC political analyst Aaron Wary has recently argued, these results represent nothing short of a, quote, age of minority governments, in which minority parliaments are now the rule, not the exception, unquote. At least under current partisan dynamics and the rules which govern Canadian politics and elections. And I concur with that assessment. Why? Well, I don't want to simply repeat my presentation from 2 years ago, but I think I'd be remiss not to highlight a few key structural features as the historian among the panel. And to do so, I'm also going to share my screen momentarily. All right. As we can see here, including Monday's election, half of all Canadian federal elections since 1957 have produced minority parliaments. That's 22 elections, 11 minority parliaments. So on the left set of columns, we've got which party became the governing party, and on the right in yellow or green, whether it was a minority or a majority. Now, 1957 onward doesn't invent minority parliaments in Canadian political history. They occasionally existed before that, but they were rare during the early to mid 20th century, the beginning of the 3-party plus political system in Canada, which was governed with few exceptions by strong liberal majorities. Why so many minority parliaments since 1957? Indeed, half. Well, as another prominent Canadian political commentator, Andrew Coyne, reminds us this morning in the Globe and Mail, vote fragmentation. From 1957 to 1979, 6 of 9 elections produced minority governments. This was an era of growing third party, a growing third party from the left, today's NDP, and stubbornly persistent regional, predominantly conservative parties, especially in Alberta and Quebec. This produced a dynamic in which from 57 until 1979, it was very hard for either the Conservatives or the Liberals to break the logjam of minority parliaments. Though Diefenbaker did it with huge success in 58, and the elder Trudeau did it twice in 68 and 74. The 1980s witnesses a demise of those third regionalist parties, which, not coincidentally, produces 3 majorities in a row. The Liberals in 1980, Conservatives in 84, and Conservatives again in 88. 2 of them huge Conservative majorities. But these Liberal majorities of the 1990s and 2000 are actually, in many regards, made possible by a new and renewed vote fragmentation, as the NDP lost its much of its base. A new Quebec regionalist party emerges, the very powerful at the time Bloc Québécois, and the division and warring of 2 separate conservative parties. In brief, 93, 97, 2000, the Liberals win a majority in Parliament and never get more than 43% of the nationwide vote. Hitherto, that had been a pretty good rule of thumb of whether a party was going to govern with majority or a minority. From 2004 onward, since the reunification of the Conservative Party, minority parliaments seem to be the norm again, with the only 2 exceptions, 2011 and 2015. Also, not coincidentally, witnessing weak Bloc Québécois seat counts. Add the Green Party to the mix, and now the People's Party, as we previously discussed, vote fragmentation appears to be here for the indefinite future. And so long as the NDP and Bloc especially remain relatively strong third and fourth parties, it's very hard to see breaking this cycle in which minority parliaments aren't just common, but they're in fact the rule instead of the exception. for the remainder of my time, I'm going to accept this premise that minority parliaments are now the norm and offer a few reflections on what I think past eras of minority parliaments can tell us about power between and within national political parties in Canada in the years ahead. And I'll be focusing on a few elections in the 60s and 70s. I'm sure I'm not the first, nor will I be the last to make the argument that it sure looks like Prime Minister Justin Trudeau hoped that this election would look like 1974, but he'll have to settle for 1965. I think this is a particularly useful comparison and helpful framework, so please permit me a few minutes to explain. Until the results came in on Monday, Justin Trudeau's political career as prime ministerial candidate and as leader of the Liberal Party tracked remarkably closely to that of another PM who just so happened to be his dad, Pierre Elliott Trudeau. Both were elected with sizable majorities in their first elections, 1968 and 2015 respectively, and were media sensations in doing so. The second time around, they were returned to power, but with reduced seats and relegated to minority governments, and forcing them to collaborate with the left-wing NDP. And then 2 years after that, both went to the polls seeking renewed majority. For the elder Trudeau, it paid off. And in 1974, the Liberals were returned with a majority. But as we saw on Monday, not the same for Trudeau fils. So if this pattern of mirroring the two Trudeaus comes to an end in this election, I think we actually start to see more patterns that might look like the 1960s, and in particular, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau hoping at least that this might look like the 1963 and then 1965 election. In 1965, Lester Pearson, then a long-serving Liberal Party leader and a sitting prime minister, a Nobel Peace Prize winner, went to the polls after 2 years in control of a minority government, hoping to win a majority on his for his second term. Didn't happen. Just like this case, 2 years after a minority parliament is returned, another minority parliament is returned, and Pearson, though reelected, is forced to again collaborate with the left-wing NDP. A few seats trade hand, they come agonizingly close to a majority, but just out of reach. What are some lessons we can take if this 65 election is actually the new model for the Liberals and in particular Prime Minister Trudeau? Well, the first, I think, relate to policy. While undoubtedly Prime Minister Justin Trudeau would have preferred to win a majority like his father did on his third crack at it, I suspect he's going to take some solace in the knowledge that the re-elected Pearson minority in 1965 has gone down in history as arguably the most productive, particularly progressive parliament in all of Canadian history. Medicare, Canada's universal healthcare system, the modern retirement social insurance system became law in that parliament. Era of renewed bilingual rights, immigration reform, the centennial, Expo 67, you name it. 65 to 68 is also a long parliament for a minority government. With no party seemingly seeking to have another election anytime soon, it certainly seems likely that the Liberals have willing partners, especially in the NDP, but also the Bloc, heck, even Conservatives, though more realistically, I think Conservative premiers of provinces on certain major matters of public policy like childcare. The second lesson, I think, relates to electoral prospects. Well, the past three elections have seen the Liberal vote share overall steadily decline, particularly jumping down from 25 to 2019, and this one just dropping a little bit. It is not a foregone conclusion that any party will win the next election. And indeed, after 2 consecutive liberal minority parliaments under Pearson, the Liberals were promoted to a majority 3 years later in 1968. So if there's any guide there, I think it suggests that there really is a jump ball. What are some lessons, though, that the Liberal government or the opposition parties thinking about cooperating with or opposing these prospects might take from it? Well, especially from the perspective of the governing Liberals, the lesson of 1965, let this parliament run for some time. They, more than any other, I suspect, will be punished if they call another snap election for the reasons David described, doubly so if there's another one on a short time frame. Second, while minority parliaments might sometimes produce inertia, parties in power, such as the 65 Liberals, can be rewarded for successful, bold action in minority parliaments. As a key element of this, again, the Liberals will win a majority in 1968. It is they who will reap the electoral benefits of the parliament that governed for about 3 years, from 65 to 68, not the NDP for those major policy wins like national health care, social insurance. But another lesson that comes with this, I think, is that it might come at the cost of the sitting prime minister. The Liberals turned those 2 minority governments into a majority parliament in 68 with a new leader at the helm, Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre Elliott Trudeau. This has not been a common experience in Canadian political history. In fact, I could think of no other example of a successful handing of the baton, as successful a handing baton as Pearson to Trudeau in modern Canadian political history. The political graves of hundreds of backbencher politicians of both parties have been dug by prime ministers who refuse to pass the baton in a timely way, leading to splits within parties or leading to the parties to literally split and go into warring factions. In 1984, the Liberals were reduced from 147 seats to a rump of 40 seats following the elder Trudeau's belated resignation. And in 1993, the then Conservative Party was reduced from 169 seats to a grand total of 2 following the belated resignation of Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. I hesitate to talk about more recent resignations or lack thereof. That's still alive football in Canadian politics. But I think it's fair to say that many gallons of ink have been spilt in opinion columns about resignations or lack thereof. So to recap, and then to open for some talk and Q&A, if history is any guide, just trying to think about what patterns stood out to me from this election, putting it in context in the history of minority parliaments in Canadian political history. First, let this parliament work. There is seems to be, as everyone thus far has been talking about, there seems to be a deep desire among most voters, irrespective of who folks are voting for, that this parliament should work. Second, that a second minority government need not hide from bold policy measures, and in fact can be rewarded if it accomplishes them. And 3, to plan proactively for an effective leadership succession. Easier said than done, but worth considering all the same. So why don't I stop sharing my screen, and we can all have a quick discussion. If any of the panelists want to discuss a point raised by another panelist, now's the time, and then we'll get to your questions.
Brendan, could I just jump in on your very interesting commentary and just
Please
raise a couple of points that come to mind. First of all, I was interested in your first slide that showed that all of the governments since '57, minority, and I didn't count exactly, I'm sure I didn't count correctly, but it is the case that out of those, whatever, 64 years since 1957, most of the time, roughly 2/3 of the time, you had minority governments. And so you have something like 10 majority governments, and something like in 15 or 18 of the years, you have something like 10 minority governments. So obviously the, and this is the political scientist in me, what you get with minority governments is typically short-run governments, and you don't have the big longer-term governments. So you could argue from the point of view of a government actually doing something, putting through programs, implementing legislation, especially complex legislation, a good majority government is preferable. So that's just an observation. The second on the 65 is a very interesting case, and you spent a lot of time talking about it. And I just wonder if that's an anomaly and what makes it an anomaly. I mean, I actually, as you could tell from the piece I wrote this morning, I actually thought what Trudeau should have done was to stay in office and continue to drive policy, whatever it would be. Now, it's not clear that there was an agenda that was there to be driven, but he seemed to fall into this usual cycle of a short-term minority government. And that raises a third question, which is, what is it about Canadian politics that has resulted in a distribution of support such that we typically get minority, more frequently than not, we get minority governments rather than majority governments. I mean, one of the features that's interesting is we don't, coming from a European perspective, I'm used to seeing coalition governments all the time. There's not a country that doesn't have a coalition government. We're going to see another election this Sunday in Germany, and the only question will be who's in the coalition. And what we have is the preconditions for a coalition, but without a coalition happening. And one of the things that was perplexing to me is that why there wasn't some deal done between the Liberals and the NDP to say, look, let's have a coalition government, serve out the remainder of the term, and we'll do what the Europeans do. Now, there are obviously reasons why that wasn't going to work, right? Shannon is doesn't think that's a possibility, but it does raise the interesting question about why is it, in terms of the structure of the party system, that Canada seems to inevitably have this propensity for occasional majorities, but quite frequent minority governments. And then, of course, the question is, can minority governments do something? 65 is interesting to you precisely because it is an anomaly in some sense. And we typically don't get the kind of 65 experience when we have a minority government. It's usually sitting there, and sooner or later, it'll either go to the polls or it'll get defeated. So that's a very interesting observation, and something we obviously need to think more about, and in at least in the next few years, while we're wondering about whether there will be another minority government or another election, why Canada has had these so frequently.
If I could just actually pick up on the point about coalitions, David, and why the NDP Liberal coalition probably would never work. One of the problems with the first past the post system in Canada is that the Liberals and the NDP and the Conservatives have been taught that the winner takes all. And so it's never been taught to be cooperative. And so when you see coalitions occur in European countries, it's usually because it's a proportional representation. And so you're learned to, or you're taught as parties to be cooperative. And that's not what a first past the post system teaches. And so when you're working, in terms of being competitive, like the first past the post system, it's really difficult to drop that afterwards in the House of Commons and say, okay, how are we going to be cooperative? And so, and it's also really difficult to actually convince people and pundits and your supporters that now you are working together, and that it's sort of Jagmeet Singh and Justin Trudeau are working together. And how do you then parse that out at election time, as Brendan puts it? How do you parse it out and say, well, this is a Liberal policy, and we're fighting for Liberals who did this in the next election? So that then becomes an issue overall as well. So I can see that being a difficult thing to sell we used to talk about this in Alberta when it was Albertans trying to dump the long-standing Conservatives. Well, if the opposition members all sort of got together, we could actually make some meaningful change, and no one was interested in doing that. There was just no way. We don't want to cooperate. That's why first past the post makes it very, very difficult. But just in sort of keeping in that conversation, Brendan, I think one of the things that's also working in terms of keeping it a long-term minority government is the fact that the NDP have no money left. We're going to be involved in a number of leadership reviews, including the Liberal leadership review as well. So I think we've got at least another 2 years, if not more, in terms of people needing to get their party coffers up again. And also, one of the problems we had with this last election was COVID made it a problem in terms of finding polling stations. We could not hold polling stations at schools because of COVID. And so that was one of the reasons why potentially the numbers were down, why the lineups were so bad, for 4-hour waits, I think, in places in Toronto. So it was not a good idea, and it will be difficult to have another election during COVID. So I think we are definitely in for a long-term election. I think that one of the ideas that will come across now as a result of minority election is going to be pharmacare. We're definitely going to have childcare, and I think that we're going to actually start having discussions about things like climate change. But David, to answer your question, I think that we don't like to play nice in Canada because of that first past the post system.
Yeah, I guess my only question is, comes back to that point, Brendan's point about 65 being an anomaly, and whether that may be an anomaly, and the more frequent pattern may be that minority governments don't really have the capacity to do much because they can't mobilize a majority in a parliament to get legislation done. Now, that actually, the Liberals were able to do that in the last 2 years to some degree, at least on the budget and a few things like that, by doing ad hoc deals with NDP and others. But the general, I would think the general view of a minority government would be that inaction or inability to take major policy steps sort of comes with the absence of a majority. So I guess I'm still interested in Brendan's point about the extent to which, let's put aside 65 and talk about all those other instances of minority governments, and what is the take on that? Did they do anything, or were they locked into a pattern of immobilism, inability to act because they really couldn't get much done in the House?
I'll answer that briefly, and I know Andy, I want
Go
to
ahead.
get you to jump in there. So the reason why I think 65 stood out to me is that it is a second back-to-back re-elected minority, both of which the leading party has quite a few seats ahead of the official opposition, relatively close to a majority, but still, by-elections aren't going to get them there, and they have multiple potential partners, especially the NDP. And so, just thinking about like the historical, trying to think about minority back-to-back minorities, especially ones governed by the same party in back-to-back years. Those were the two. 63 to 65 stood out the most to me as just the most analogous. But I grant you that 65, in terms of the actual policy achieved, it does seem like an anomaly. I think, to me, the question is it that the very nature of those back-to-back, in which it's the same party being reelected, both to strong minority situations. This isn't Paul Martin in 2004 desperately clinging on for a year and a half before the Harper conservatives biting at their tails every couple extra percentage points every single election until 2011. I really do think 2019, 2021 is there's nothing else that compares as well as 63 to 65. Andy, though, please.
Well, I wanted to jump in there on something that David just said, because I think you raised a very important point, and that is, in the last 2 years, the Trudeau government was still able to get some things done with a minority government. And we talked about the passing the budget last spring. I was able to get the NDP to support that measure. So I think one of the criticisms that Trudeau got this time around was that he could have actually stayed the course right up until next 2 years and have the election at the regular time, because he was getting things done. It wasn't as though he wasn't getting anything done. They were still getting, they were on the margins getting things done. But there was a sense that if he did want to collaborate with the NDP was actually willing to play ball in many cases. And this raises another question about minority governments, right? Trudeau got a lot of flack for not following through on the reform of the electoral process in Canada. You remember he made that big statement about changing the electoral process, moving to from the first past the post to a proportional representational system, and then he changed his mind. And my sense was that within the Liberal Party, people realized that if that happened, you're going to have a lot of elections on a regular basis, because you look at Israel, look at Germany, look at different places where they have proportional representation, and one of the major features is the regularity of elections, and I think the Liberal Party didn't want to move in that direction, and that's one of the reasons why he started to backtrack on his promise. But you have to wonder, now that you see Brandon, you see your chart with all those minority governments, whether or not it might not have been a good idea to have a proportional representational system and force the parties to collaborate more. I think consultation and collaboration, especially among the progressive parties, could be very, very good for Canada and can get probably a lot more done on those circumstances.
Wonderful. I see we've got about half dozen questions in the open queue. So why don't we try to answer a few folks' questions? I've got a few here that seem to be really wondering about the NDP. Is there a polling? Was there a polling miss on the NDP? Or is it? We've got questions from a few folks about the relative popularity of the leader of the NDP. Why did the NDP succeed in a few ridings in Edmonton? But also, why, if this is a polling miss, why did the NDP come in a bit under its expected performance? Anyone want to take a stab at those questions?
Let me take a stab at the NDP in Edmonton, Strathcona, because that's where I teach right now at the University of Alberta. This is an anomaly for Alberta to have a very strong, progressive, left-leaning kind of candidate winning in Strathcona, Edmonton, Strathcona. We've had them in the past. We've had very strong leaders from the NDP winning in that particular riding. The reason why I think that's the case is because, of course, the bulk of the people that go to the university tend to be closer to a left-leaning population, and are very supportive of the NDP in that riding. I don't know why it is that Singh didn't do better than he was projected to do. I think part of it has to do with the fact that some people argue that some people are not ready yet to have. They don't want to use this term, but to have someone from a different religion lead a party to the prime ministership. I don't know if that's the case or not. We've had prime ministers who were Roman Catholics. We've had prime ministers that were Anglicans. We've never had prime minister that was a Sikh before, and I think this is one of the challenges that you have in some parts of Canada, not being able to embrace someone like Singh, and I think that's a mistake in some cases, because Canada is a very diverse country and it's becoming increasingly more and more diverse. So we have to be more accepting of differences of people from different religions, the different different sexes and genders and so on. That's something that we have to pay much more attention to. But so I don't really understand why he didn't do a lot better than he was projected to do. But he did pick up some seats, and you saw two of them in Alberta. He's picked up some seats in different parts of the country, one or two seats in different parts of the country. So there is some hope there for the NDP, and I don't think there are knives out for him in the same way that I think there will be for O'Toole in the next round. I think O'Toole is in big trouble when it comes to the Conservative Party, because half the party, I don't think, support O'Toole. I think they sort of held their noses this time around and voted for him, but they really don't support his movement to the center. He moved from the right to the center, and I think that's one of the challenges he's going to have. And one of the reasons why he keeps insisting that Trudeau is going to call an election in 18 months is to give himself some time, to buy some time for himself to stay as leader of the party, the Conservative Party, because he would like to see Trudeau call an election in 18 months. My sense is that Trudeau will not, but he would like to see him call an election in 18 months because that would give him some time to stay at the head of the party.
So just to answer the question about the Edmonton-Griesbach riding, I was delighted to see bombastic former columnist Kerry Diot lose his seat. And he's a conservative, outspoken conservative, and he lost his seat largely as a result of the splittering of the conservative vote to the PPC. And I'm also happy to see that the very first time ever we have a two-spirit Aboriginal MP being represented in the House of Commons as a result. So that is also quite wonderful to see. And that was largely as a result of some very hard work done by the NDP. But that's an example of what happened with the PPC leader bleeding off, or the candidate bleeding off. Largely 7% of the vote went to the PPC in Edmonton-Griesbach. So that's the reason why that one lost, why Kerry Diot lost that riding. Yeah.
Thank you. I see a couple other questions specifically, which if I could summarize, really try to ask, to what degree is this election informed by the response to COVID? And if I could summarize in a nutshell, do the political considerations and policy considerations, particularly vaccine mandates and border closures, how much have they shaped this election, and to what degree might their absence in a future election shake up the electoral calculus? I'm combining two or three questions here for the sake of time, but
I still
Yeah.
can't go to Kohl's to shop, so I'm frustrated by that, that's for sure. But I'll let somebody else speak about it first before I chime in.
You know, there's no question that the COVID-19 pandemic has had a major impact on this particular election in terms of the lower numbers of people that went out to vote. I mean, obviously, Shannon pointed that out. But also, I think there is a resentment against the notion of, a government sort of impinging on the freedoms of individuals. And that's that anti-vax movement that we see in the United States is also present here in Canada as well. I think that there are in the minority, but they're a loud minority, and some people are calling it the tyranny of the minority in some cases, because they're going around to hospitals and harassing doctors and nurses, people who are supposed to be there to help them to maintain their health. And I think that's despicable, but that's what's happening right now. And the other problem is that the signaling that they're getting from some of the politicians who are of a conservative bent is also helping to fuel that kind of anti-vax notion. And so I think that did have an impact on the election to some extent. But I believe that the Prime Minister Trudeau, from the federal point of view anyway, did what he probably had to do in order to be able to give the impression, at least, that he was doing something to help Canadians, both in terms of individuals, as businesses as well, to stay afloat during this very difficult period. And he had to be given some credit for that, I think. The problem we have in Canada, of course, is that healthcare is really a provincial matter rather than a federal matter. But from the federal point of view, I think he has done enough in terms of making sure that money's got into the hands of people who were suffering as a result of the pandemic, and businesses stayed afloat so that they can actually reopen when this is all over, and we can have a rebound in the economy as a result of this. So I give him some credit for that.
Shannon or David, would you like to answer either of those questions about these dynamics?
David, do you want to go?
No, go ahead, Shannon.
I think the biggest issue that we're going to see from the fallout from this election is the massive number or a massive amount of misinformation. And this is what it all comes down to, frankly, is the ongoing problem of fighting misinformation that has started from QAnon, and it continues. And this is not misinformation that is homegrown. This is misinformation that is coming from abroad, and it is being spewed within the internet and becomes part of this kind of conspiracy issues. Part of it is COVID. It will continue to be misinformation that is being spewed on climate change. If it's not going to be about vaccinations next, it'll be about immigration next. It'll be about whatever the next kind of emergency that we are in, and it will continue to create these kinds of silos of power differentials, and it'll create anger. And so this disinformation campaign is going to be a problematic a problem for Canada and for the Americans as well, and for Western democracies everywhere. And until we actually understand what's going on, Canadian and Americans and democratic leaders around the world are going to be fighting this. And it's pitting people against each other, and it creates this type of anger that we saw in this election, that you saw on January 6th, this insurrection that occurred at the White House, that is taking people who are legitimately worried about their livelihood, are legitimately worried about democracy, are being fed misinformation, are being fueled, and then they're acting out. And until we actually do something about that misinformation, I think we have a problem with civics. I cannot say that enough.
Mm-hmm. And of course, it's not just a problem for Canada, right? It's a problem for lots of countries.
It's a problem everywhere, and but Canada is being fed it. And this
Yeah.
is what we saw this election. You saw January 6th, the White House. We're seeing it. It is insipid. And you know, people like to think that we're insulated, but we're not. And when you have someone who is as charismatic as Mad Max that's selling it, and you see pockets of it at 20% in places like Manitoba, religious leaders are sprouting it. Where do you go from there? It's frightening. I'm sounding the alarm.
Brendan, if I could just jump in on this.
Please.
I read again this morning Trudeau's announcement, August 15th announcement, why he was calling this election, and perhaps I should have mentioned this at the outset, or we should have talked about it earlier on. But I have to say, I still don't understand why he called the election, and why he couldn't have done what he said he would need the election in order to do, why he couldn't have done that. You know, when you look at this in retrospect, you have to think that he was expecting some kind of sign of collective gratitude for all of the good things that he did in terms of the vaccination, in terms of the economic recovery. You know, he didn't get the gratitude of the kind he expected, i.e., a majority. But it does make me wonder why he didn't just say, look, we can keep doing business the kind we've been doing, working with the NDP when we can, working with others if we have to. Why we would put the country through this at this particular time, because it was, you know, everyone has talked about the 500 or 600 million that the election cost, but it was really extraordinarily inconvenient for people in the midst of the COVID pandemic to think about an election, to even have an election, to run an election, to have the meetings that you have in and I just I suppose this will be a subject for some future research, why he thought this was a good idea. It just strikes me that he could have read the polls, and polls aren't very predictive sometimes, but he should have known that he wouldn't be getting a majority, probably. And so I'm at the end of this. I don't mean to keep going on this, but it is perplexing why he felt that he had to call an election when he probably could have gone the full 4 years in a minority government. Now, maybe it's just that he had all that string of minority governments that you had on your slide, and it shows, well, they all last, 15 months or 2 years. So my time's up. I better have another election. But at the end of the day, I have to say I'm perplexed why someone smart in the Liberal Party didn't say, look, let's just keep going, keep working, work for the people, and save us about 600 million.
Mm-hmm.
That's probably the Scot in me speaking on that last point. But
if I could jump in there, what I believe it was on Steve Pakin's show that I watched recently, where a liberal political analyst was saying it likely, the calculation probably boiled down to the thought of, if not now, when? Exactly. And thinking about that history, even though, as you were saying, that the likelihood of a liberal majority was far from certain, and indeed, at best, a roll of the dice. It also, looking ahead, again in historical terms, 65, to your point of 65 potentially being an anomaly, in their calculations, it probably was as good a time as any to give it a shot for majority or to extend their mandate. We are starting to run out of time. Indeed, we are just there, but I want to note that we have 3 more questions, and I'm going to try to quickly just note them because thank you everyone for participating. Someone was asking about if there's any connection between the old Socreds to the People's Party. Another person followed up on Andy's commentary about what does this mean about the future of foreign relations and Canada's place in the world. And additionally, I believe there's a question about was there a writing that shocked us all? And I think we've actually each briefly in passing in our own comments addressed those 3 comments, those 3 questions. But I just really wanted to thank all of you for participating in this panel, for joining us, and for such great questions. That wraps up our panel today. Thank you again to Jay, to Hira, and especially to our panelists.
So much fun.
For this wonderful conversation. Really informative. And maybe we'll be here again in 2 years, maybe in 4. We'll see how long this minority lasts.
Thanks, Brendan.
Thank you all.
Thanks
Thank
for
you all, too.
guiding us through this.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
Such an
For your time.
honor. Thank you.